30 seconds, decades upon decades of movies, books, and retellings. Even if you're dipping your toe into Western folklore, you probably have heard of this legendary battle. If you haven't, let's briefly cover what the OK Corral supposedly is. The OK Corral was a horse corral and livery in Tombstone, Arizona. The corral burned down in 1882, along with a good chunk of the business district surrounding it. But nearly 150 years later, it's still remembered for the gunfight that happened there. The gunfight was one that involved many fascinating individuals, such as Wyatt Earp, legendary lawman, his friend Doc Holliday, and Wyatt's brothers Morgan and Virgil. Together, they took on a group of outlaws calling themselves the Cochise County Cowboys, home to some of the toughest outlaws in the West, like Ike Clanton and his brother Billy, and Tom and Frank McClory, and many other rough outlaws. In 30 seconds at this corral, the battle was over, and the heroes won. The villainous cowboys suffered a major blow today. Everything's fine then, right? Well, not exactly. History isn't so black and white, especially when we're talking about an era that has been romanticized and exaggerated for over a century. Yes, what you may have heard about the gunfight is wrong, and not just wrong, but covering up some disturbing truths that show the bad guys weren't as bad as you think, and the heroes were a little more complex. There are also some shocking truths about the OK Corral that completely recontextualize the whole event. If you've ever been to the reenactments, you probably know about these events. Well, let's say those are best kept as fiction, when the truth is far darker. So let's look at the 10 truths of the OK Corral you may not have heard about. But before we do, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. Our first secret will surprise you. After all, it unmasks the truth behind the actual name of the event. Did the OK Corral gunfight really happen at the OK Corral, a place in Tombstone? The gunfight at the OK Corral didn't take place at the OK Corral. Yes, you heard that right. The gunfight did happen, but it was not at the OK Corral. But how can this be? Well, when retelling a story for film, people change some facts around to make them seem more exciting. What popularized the gunfight at the OK Corral was the 1957 movie of the same name. However, the explosion of romanticized westerns in the 1950s wasn't entirely to blame. The newspapers at the time also called the shootout the gunfight at the OK Corral. This period was a time when reporting was often done by hearsay, and exaggerations usually became fact. Later on, people would refer to it by the more correct name, the incident near the OK Corral. In truth, the gunfight took place down Fremont Street near the corral on a vacant lot, which was located on the side of C.S. Fly's photography studio, home of one of the most famous photojournalists that chronicled the silver mining booth in Tombstone, Arizona. However, that isn't as exciting. The idea of livestock thieves at the corral itself and innocent people and animals potentially getting caught in the crossfire is much more exciting. A photography studio, meanwhile, doesn't invoke that feeling of grit. The biggest casualty with that location is probably a few frames getting shot. But okay, you may say that it doesn't matter too much if the fight didn't take place at the corral. It still happened, and a group of good guys took down a group of bad guys. Raises the stakes and creates an exciting situation, right? Except, what if we were to tell you that the good guys weren't so good? Wyatt Earp didn't have a squeaky clean past. Wyatt Earp is often seen as a lawman who wants to keep the peace, but that's the movies talking. In truth, Earp was a highly complex man who was on the wrong side of the law himself, and he often gets more credit for being a lawman than his brothers. Many of the stories painted him in many different ways. But okay, who among us hasn't messed up a few times? Well, what if we told you that he was arrested several times for not only being in a brothel, but possibly being a pimp? Enter the town of Peoria, Illinois. This was a fairly large town at the time with over 22,000 people. It was the original Sin City where law enforcement seemed to ignore vice. This was the perfect place for brothel owners until the lawmen decided to clean up. On February 24, 1872, the Peoria police raided a brothel and arrested Wyatt and Morgan Earp, along with several others. Earp was allegedly pimping, and on May 11th, they were arrested again. Then, on September 10th, Earp was arrested again aboard the Beardstown gunboat, which was used as a brothel as well. Along with him, a woman claiming to be his wife, Sally Heckle, was also arrested. However, likely she wasn't his wife, but the daughter of brothel owner Jane Haspel. The daughter's age? 16. Earp later claims that he was hunting buffalo during this time, but that is merely a cover story, and this wasn't his first run-in with the law. A year prior, on April 6, 1871, Earp was arrested for horse theft. These incidents happened shortly after the death of his first wife, Urilla Sutherland. Ireland, who passed away from typhoid fever before she could deliver their kid. She was just in her early 20s, and even when he was in law enforcement, he had trouble. In Wichita, he became deputy, but that ended when a former marshal, Bill Smith, accused him of nepotism when he hired his brothers to work as lawmen. Earp's answer to the accusation? Beating up Smith in a fistfight. His negative reputation was also the source of negative publicity. The Fort Worth Gazette in 1894 wrote that Earp was head of a band of desperado, a partner in stage robberies, and a friend of gamblers and professional killers. He was painted as negative when compared to Behan, whom he supposedly had a deadly feud with. More rumors spread as well, courtesy of his former nemesis, Johnny Behan, who continued to spread rumors, including in the Washington Post, where he talked discouragingly about Earp's behaviors in Tombstone. While some of it might have been hearsay, there is probably a grain of truth to it, especially with the shadowy reputation and issues with the law he had before. We love complex figures, as history is made that way. Rarely are there people truly good or truly bad. But the myth of Wyatt Earp tells of a flawless man who wanted to bring order to towns when he had his own demons he was battling. However, there is someone else who was the real hero in this circumstance. Virgil's brother, Wyatt, was the true lawman. Wyatt Earp is a name that most enthusiasts of the West know, and even those who aren't as invested in Western folklore. However, his brother, Virgil, has been obscured by history. The funny thing is that Wyatt has been epitomized as a true lawman, but in reality, Wyatt got into plenty of legal trouble, and Virgil was more straight-laced. He also had far fewer negative words said about him. Virgil's story is pretty simple at the start. At 16, he eloped with a 17-year-old immigrant named Magdalena Seacott. Ellen Reidsdom. Some reports say that they occasionally saw each other, keeping their relationship a scandalous secret until she had their daughter, Nellie. While her parents were furious, Virgil's parents were against the marriage because they thought he was far too young. The parents worked to get the marriage annulled, but it was supposedly unsuccessful. Because of Virgil's refusal, Virgil was a Civil War veteran in the Union Army, leaving his wife and daughter behind. When he returned from the war, both were gone. Later in life, he would reunite with them and discover that Ellen's family told her that he died in the war, when in reality, they didn't approve of the marriage. Later, he met Elvira Allie Sullivan in Florence, Nebraska. He traveled about with his brother, settling in Dodge City with his brother for a spell. While he did not directly hold a law enforcement position, Allie mentioned he worked as a deputy town marshal alongside his brother. While both he and Wyatt had tragedies with their first wives, Virgil did not turn to crime. His first location after returning from war was Camp Verde, where he delivered mail and drove passengers between Prescott and Cape Verde via the Starline stage. His love for justice continued despite him owning a sawmill in Prescott. He pursued two men along the edge of town where a fight occurred. While seeing the adversary reloading a pistol, he shot the man with a Winchester, killing him with a headshot. From that point, he was the constable for Prescott, where he served subpoenas, summons, and warrants. Wyatt encouraged Virgil to go to Tombstone because it was a booming mining town. He became the deputy U.S. Marshal and City Marshal of Tombstone by Crawley Drake after finding out about Virgil's move. He led his brothers during the so-called gunfight at the OK Corral. Not only that, but he wasn't a shoot-first kind of man. Before the fight, his goal was to disarm the cowboys peacefully. This didn't work, but it shows that lawmen in the Old West weren't necessarily about tough justice. Often they wanted an outcome where no one got injured or died. Virgil also suffered a crippled arm after an ambush attempt commonly blamed on the Clantons. However, Virgil did have good spirits about this, telling his wife Allie that he still had one arm to hug her with. History shows that Virgil, while a flawed human, was more of a lawman than his brother Wyatt, who got into trouble many times. However, the public consciousness and pop culture remember Wyatt more. Why? Besides Hollywood telling an exaggerated spin on the tale, say it boils down to something a little more petty. Wyatt Earp rolls off the tongue better than Virgil Earp. While that sounds ridiculous, sometimes the most straightforward and silliest explanation is likely the best. So the good guys were a little different than expected. But what about the reasoning? Was it really just a fight between good and bad? Well, the gunfight has political motives. The gunfight at OK Corral was not a result of lawmen versus bandits, but it had nuanced political motivations. One motivation was that the Earps and Doc Holliday were trying to enforce a city ordinance that banned the carrying of guns in town, while the Clantons and McClorys were resistant to such a law. Already there's nuance here. Gun control is still an issue hotly debated in the public square and online spheres, but one may also argue that a gunfight proved that maybe the Earps had a reason to ban firearms. However, there's a lot more to it than just that proposal. The cowboys, including the Clantons and McClorys, made a living smuggling and rustling cattle. This was how many small ranchers at the time made a living. Also, there was a long-standing political rivalry between these two factions. The Earps were Republicans and the cowboys were Democrats. As a reminder, these two parties had different political beliefs than what we associate with them today. Either way, this was a time before political disagreements weren't settled through flame wars online, but actual fights. However, history often downplays or ignores the political tensions at the time, once again settling for a good versus evil narrative. Instead, it was the result of a battle that erupted due to conflicting ideas that we can see on both sides. Some people can empathize with the cowboys' love for freedom and distrust of the law, while some may believe that laws, regulations, and sometimes a bit of force are essential to have a civilized society. But it gets even stranger, as this rivalry can dive into conspiracy territory. Tensions between the Earps and the cowboys escalated even further after a stagecoach robbery where the driver and passenger were killed. Harry Head and his cowboy companions led this robbery, and it soured tensions between the cowboys and the Earps. But what if we were to tell you that there may be another side to this story? Doc Holliday was spotted leaving the scene of the crime. The conspiracy is that Doc Holliday was involved in this robbery. There is even testimony from Ike Clanton, who claimed that Wyatt Earp proposed a fake stagecoach robbery. Now, we want to be clear that there is no hard evidence that this happened. However, there are enough questions that can raise an eyebrow, and we know that agent provocateurs and false flag attacks can happen. So we don't know the true intentions of politics of the shootout, but who fired the shots? No one knows who shot. Depending on which movie you watch, one party or the other will shoot first, and this is narratively motivated. In the 1957 Gunfight movie, the cowboys shoot first. In the 1950s, cowboy movies depicting frontier justice, law, and order were popular. Having the cowboys shoot first in the narrative would give the Earps Holliday a reason to defend themselves. However, in a grittier movie like Tombstone, Holliday shoots first after tensions explode. The movie does show him shooting when a gun is pulled on him, but still, he fired the first shot. So historically, who shot first? Eyewitness testimony about this shooting is contradictory, and the people who claimed one shot first over the other were often biased. The fight was chaotic and smoky, and many ran away when the gunshots were heard or saw the action just as it was wrapping up. Making out who shot who in all of that chaos would be next to impossible in most cases. So in truth, no one knows who fired first, a mystery that will never be truly solved unless someone invents a time machine. The town mourned the outlaws. You may think that when outlaws are rampaging a town and are gunned down, the town wouldn't mourn their deaths but throw them into a ditch somewhere. However, Tombstone reacted much differently than you would think. First, the bodies of Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton were displayed in a window at Ritter and Ream, specialized in being undertakers. Take a look at this photo. Does this seem like how a town would dispose of outlaws? By giving them beautiful caskets? Not at all, which is what's shocking about their timely passing. One can argue that these guys had nicer caskets than what someone today might get for their funeral. There was also a sign next to these bodies. The sign said, "Murdered in the streets of Tombstone." The word murdered usually wouldn't apply to outlaws shot dead by the law. Okay, but surely no one attended the funeral, right? How about as many as 2,000 watching, as 300 people joined in on the procession? Very few people have such a large funeral, yet these outlaws had one reserved for celebrities and politicians. These guys were a very big deal, at least for the people in this town. And to this day, you can see their graves if you go to visit Tombstone. On the headstones, the message that they were murdered is loud and clear. The media and movies later on favored the gunmen, but the town itself seemed to favor the outlaws. Would an entire town be evil? Why would people grieve unless there was more to the story? No one knows what weapons were used. In 2014, Wyatt Earp's Colt 45 sold for a whopping $225,000. A USA Today article of the story said this, headlining the auction, was a Colt .45 caliber revolver that descendants of Earp say was carried during his time in Tombstone, Arizona, and possibly used in the shootout at the OK Corral. The words "say" and "possibly" are key here. No one knows the weapons used during the shootout, they know T, nor if the original characters truly valued the guns sold in these auctions. Someone spent nearly $250,000 not to buy history but a legend. We do know some things. Tom McClory was likely killed by a double-barreled shotgun used by Doc Holliday. Some cowboys, like Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne, claimed to be unarmed, while others may have carried revolvers. You need to remember that video recording did not exist at the time, and cameras were elaborate and could not capture such a fight while it was hot. Furthermore, eyewitness testimony and even the testimony of those involved were unreliable. This is a reminder always to be skeptical whenever an auction is selling authentic memorabilia owned by a historical figure or used in a historic event. Who authenticated it? Is there any documentation that the people used the memorabilia? Always do your research before spending money on something that may be worth less than you bought it for. Remember, the shootout lasted only 30 seconds, and witnesses who stayed had a hard time seeing through the smoke. Our next secret is about something a little different, once again, about intent, but questions who was truly responsible for such a fight. Horrors of the cycle of revenge. As we mentioned, an assassination attempt led Virgil Earp to have a crippled arm, and his brother Morgan was worse off, having been killed. Wyatt Earp blamed this assassination and assassination attempt on the Cowboys and led a federal posse to hunt them down. This event was known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. Frank Stillwell was one man who was murdered with a shotgun by Wyatt, and to the law, this act of revenge wasn't justified, but a cold-blooded murder, especially since there was no proof that Stillwell had done the crimes Wyatt had accused him of. Wyatt agreed to turn himself in, but then changed his mind. He fled to Colorado, showing that, once again, he was not a man who respected the law. His posse, meanwhile, killed 3 more men. Frontier justice is yet another thing romanticized by the movies, but in reality it's messy, and sometimes you kill the wrong people. Don't get us wrong, it is definitely within the realm of possibility that the Cowboys sought revenge for what had happened at the OK Corral fight. However, this became a cycle where Earp sought revenge for what happened to his brothers. Once again, we don't know if the Cowboys were responsible. The Earps had made many enemies, so it could have been another group that struck, while the gunfight was fresh in hopes of blaming the Cowboys. Revenge is certainly satisfying in the movies, but in real life, we believe everyone has the right to a fair trial. So we know the good guys were not that good, and that the intent behind the gunfight might be different than we thought. But this next secret goes mask off and tells the real story of Ike Clanton. Ike Clanton was a coward, not a criminal mastermind. Some movies and media treat Ike Clanton as if he were a mob boss who not only called the shots but also shot them. However, the real Ike Clanton was anything but. He was known for heavy drinking and writing checks he couldn't cash. Before the gunfight, Clanton was talking about how he would gun down the Earps, but when the gunfight actually happened, Ike rushed toward Wyatt Earp but did not kill him. Instead, he told Wyatt that he wasn't going to fight because he was unarmed, and Wyatt replied, "Go to fighting or get away." He ran from the fight without a scratch while his companions paid the price. And when the dust had settled, Ike tried to get revenge, but not how you would think. Instead of gunning down the Earps, he tried taking them to court for murder. However, all charges were dropped. Clanton eventually did die at the hands of the law, but not by the Earps or Doc Holliday. Instead, he fought with Jonas Brighton, hired by the Apache County Stock Association to take him out. And Clanton did not have an epic gunfight, but instead was shot dead before he could even fire back. Before the man hit the dirt, he was dead. Whitewashing the past is profitable. And finally, the last dark secret is that romanticizing the past through tabloid journalism, Hollywood movies, and other stories makes good money. One could argue that this dark secret is one of the most apparent if you look hard enough. People don't want a nuanced tale of corrupt, complex lawmen versus equally complicated criminals. Instead, they want a world where good defeats evil and happy endings exist. The 1957 gunfight at the OK Corral film made over $10 million against a $2 million budget, and this is 1950s money we're talking about. Tombstone, another film loosely based on these events, made over $75 million against a $25 million budget. These films are great, but many people don't learn the true story. Even on a smaller scale, this event is still romanticized through souvenirs and reenactments, not to mention auctions of the weapons that were claimed to have been used. In the reenactments, the good guys are cheered and the bad guys are booed. Again, these can all be fun to attend, but these reenactments and movies are merely legends. But legends can be profitable, while the truth is merely buried in the texts of the history books. So, if you do choose to attend an event like this, please remember that it is romanticized and not completely like the historical event. The gunfight at the OK Corral is a legend that will not disappear anytime soon. More movies will be made about it, and even in an age when people are going to sell you the true story, events will still be exaggerated or omitted for the sake of a good narrative. We're not saying you need to look at a history book every time you watch a movie. But it's important to separate fact from fiction when enjoying these movies. Remember that the fight at the OK Corral didn't even take place at said corral. Remember that Wyatt Earp wasn't a flawless hero, but a troubled man who got into fights and sex crimes. Remember that many in Tombstone didn't celebrate the killing of the cowboys, but instead mourned them. To us, the grittiness and nuanced stories of the West are much more exciting than the tales of good versus evil we thought we believed. They show how complicated humans are and how often there are no winners. Instead, this story was one of political tensions, possible conspiracies, and cycles of revenge. But what are your thoughts? Was there something you learned about the shooting that surprised you? Did you already know that the shooting was a little more complicated than you thought? Did we get something wrong, or do you disagree that the shooting wasn't as complex as we're claiming it is? If so, why? We'd love to hear what you have to say. If you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. Join us in the next video as we uncover and demystify more stories from the frontier.